Los Angeles, April 1976. The Beverly Wilshire Hotel conference room held 500 journalists, 23 cameras, and one man who could barely remember his own name. David Bowie sat behind a polished mahogany table, his frame so thin that the Armani suit hung loose on his shoulders like a costume 2 sizes too large. His skin possessed the translucent quality of someone who hadn't seen daylight in weeks. Behind designer sunglasses, his eyes darted between faces he couldn't quite focus on, searching for threats in a room full of strangers with notebooks and recording devices. The air conditioning hummed with mechanical precision, but Bowie's shirt collar showed dark crescents of sweat. His fingers, decorated with silver rings that caught the harsh camera lights, trembled slightly as they reached for a glass of water. He lifted it halfway to his lips before setting it down again, untouched. For months now, the only things he'd been able to consume were milk, red peppers, and cocaine. Everything else tasted like ashes. This was supposed to be a routine promotional event for his new album, Station to Station. But that was before the incident at Victoria Station in London. Before the photographs that newspapers across Europe were still dissecting frame by frame. Before the single gesture that threatened to unravel everything he'd built over the past decade. Before we continue this story, I need to ask you something. If you want to discover more untold stories about the legends who changed music history forever, subscribe to this channel. Because what happened in that conference room wasn't just about one man's career. It was about how close we came to losing one of the most important artists of the 20th century. The press conference had been delayed twice already. Bowie's manager had tried to cancel it entirely. But the record company executives were adamant. Silence would be interpreted as guilt. Absence would become admission. Bowie needed to face the press, needed to answer the questions, needed to prove that he was still the thin white duke, still the man in control. What none of them understood was that there was no David Bowie anymore. Not really. The man behind that table was a collection of characters fighting for dominance in a mind that had been chemically stripped of its ability to distinguish between performance and reality. Ziggy Stardust had been buried 3 years ago at Hammersmith Odeon, but his ghost still whispered. Aladdin Sane had supposedly been retired, but his fractured consciousness still split Bowie's thoughts. And now the thin white duke, this new creation, this aristocratic monster, had taken control. The problem was simple and terrifying. The Duke had fascist sympathies, and unlike Bowie's previous characters, he couldn't be killed with a simple stage announcement. The journalists waited with predatory patience. Most of them wanted to talk about the music, about the album, about the upcoming tour. But sitting in the third row, bourbon-drunk and angry about a fight with his editor that morning, was a reporter named Michael Watts from Melody Maker. He had a different question prepared. He had been waiting for 3 weeks, waiting for exactly this moment. Bowie's publicist, a severe woman named Patricia, stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Mr. Bowie will now take your questions. Please state your name and publication before speaking." The first questions were softballs. A woman from Rolling Stone asked about the recording process. Bowie answered in a voice that sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well, something about working at Cherokee Studios, about the influence of German electronic music. His words were eloquent, almost scripted. But his delivery was mechanical. He was reading from a teleprompter that only he could see, one written in cocaine and sleepless nights. Young journalist from the New Musical Express asked about the tour. Bowie's response took nearly 4 minutes, a meandering answer that touched on lighting design, costume concepts, and the theatricality of fascist imagery. That last phrase hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Several journalists looked up from their notebooks, sensing blood in the water. The publicist tried to move quickly to the next question, but Michael Watts was already standing. He didn't wait to be called on. His voice, roughened by alcohol and anger, cut across the room with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his mind for weeks. "Mr. Bowie," he said, and the room went quiet in that special way that precedes disasters. 3 weeks ago, at Victoria Station in London, you were photographed appearing to give what looked very much like a Nazi salute from the back of your open-top Mercedes. The photographs have been published in every major newspaper in Europe. Some people are saying it was a wave gone wrong. Others are calling you a fascist sympathizer. But here's what I want to know. Are you, or have you ever been, a supporter of National Socialist ideology? Because if you are, then we need to know. And if you aren't, then why would you make a gesture that even remotely resembles the salute of a regime that murdered millions? 500 people stopped breathing. 23 cameras turned as one organism toward the man behind the mahogany table. Patricia's face drained of color so quickly she looked like she might faint. The record company executive in the back of the room actually stood up, as if physical height might give him some control over what was about to happen. But none of them were prepared for what Bowie did next. He removed his sunglasses slowly, with the deliberate precision of someone revealing a weapon. His eyes, when they were finally visible, looked like they belonged to a different species. One pupil was permanently dilated from an old injury, giving him an asymmetrical appearance that photographs never quite captured. He stared directly at Michael Watts with an intensity that made several people in the front row actually lean back in their seats. Then David Bowie smiled. It was the thin white Duke's smile, cold and aristocratic, the smile of someone who had seen the machinery of the universe and found it amusing. When he spoke, his voice had changed entirely. Gone was the uncertain, hollow tone from earlier. This voice was crystalline, precise, the voice of a man who had suddenly remembered exactly who he was supposed to be. "Mr. Watts," he said, and his accent had shifted too, becoming more clipped, more European, more dangerous. "That's a fascinating question. Let me answer it with the completeness it deserves. What happened next would be debated, analyzed, and mythologized for decades. Some people in that room would claim Bowie defended himself brilliantly. Others would insist he confessed to sympathies that should have ended his career. Still others would argue that what they witnessed wasn't David Bowie at all, but some other entity speaking through his body. The truth existed in the spaces between these interpretations. "I want to be very clear about something," Bowie continued, his fingers now steady on the table, the trembling gone as if it had never existed. "I am not now, nor have I ever been, a supporter of fascism. I am not a Nazi. I am not a sympathizer with genocidal ideologies. What I am, Mr. Watts, is an artist who has been exploring the dangerous territories of the human psyche, and sometimes that exploration takes me to places that make people uncomfortable." He paused, and in that pause the room seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. Patricia was making frantic cutting gestures from the side of the room, but Bowie ignored her with the serene indifference of someone who had already decided to walk into the fire. "The incident you're referring to was a wave that was misinterpreted, miscaptured, and misrepresented. I was waving to fans. The angle was unfortunate. The timing was worse. But here's what's really interesting about your question. You're not really asking if I'm a fascist. You're asking if I'm dangerous. You're asking if art should have boundaries. Michael Watts, to his credit, didn't back down. I'm asking if you think Hitler's aesthetic was, and I quote from your interview with Cameron Crowe, really beautiful and very romanticized. Because that's what you said, Mr. Bowie. Those were your words. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. This was worse than anyone had anticipated. Watts had brought receipts, had done his research, had loaded his weapon with Bowie's own words, and was now pulling the trigger in front of 500 witnesses. Bowie's smile never wavered, but something behind his eyes flickered. For just a moment, the mask slipped, and the people in the front row could see what lived behind it. Terror, confusion, and the desperate scrambling of a man trying to remember which character he was supposed to be. Playing. Context, Bowie said finally, and his voice had dropped to nearly a whisper, forcing every person in that room to strain forward to hear him. Context is everything, Mr. Watts. What I said, what I meant, was that Hitler understood the power of imagery, of spectacle, of using visual language to manipulate emotion. I didn't say his ideology was beautiful. I said his aesthetic was effective. But then, and this was the moment that would be replayed and analyzed for the next 40 years, Bowie said something that nobody expected. However, he continued, his voice now carrying a strange, hypnotic quality. I will admit this. There have been periods in my life, particularly recent periods, where my judgment has been so compromised by exhaustion and other factors that I cannot entirely trust my own statements. There have been moments where I've said things that, upon reflection, horrify me, not because they were taken out of context, but because I genuinely don't remember the mindset that produced them. The room erupted. Journalists started shouting questions over each other. Cameras flashed in a strobing pattern that looked like distant artillery. Patricia was now actively trying to end the conference, but Bowie held up one hand, and somehow, impossibly, the room quieted again. I want to be honest with you all, Bowie said, and now his voice had changed again, stripped of the aristocratic affect, suddenly vulnerable, suddenly human. For the past 2 years, I have been living in Los Angeles, consuming approximately 7 grams of cocaine per day. I have not eaten a proper meal in months. I have not seen sunlight except when absolutely necessary. I have covered the mirrors in my house because I cannot stand to see my own reflection. I have been living as the Thin White Duke, a character I created for the Station to Station album. But somewhere in the past 6 months, the Duke stopped being a character and became the only thing I could be. The silence now was different. It wasn't the predatory silence of journalists sensing blood. It was the stunned silence of people witnessing a public breakdown, a confession so raw and unexpected that nobody knew how to respond. So when you ask me if I'm a Nazi sympathizer, Bowie continued, what I hear is a much more important question. Am I responsible for the things I've said when I wasn't entirely myself? And the answer is yes. I have to be. Because if I'm not responsible for my own words, then who is? The drugs? The character? The darkness? None of those things absolve me. Michael Watts, his own anger now transmuted into something closer to concern, asked quietly, Are you asking for forgiveness, Mr. Bowie? Bowie put his sunglasses back on, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who had just revealed more than he intended. I'm asking for understanding. I'm admitting that I've lost control. I'm confessing that the exploration of dark territories has taken me to places I didn't expect to go. But most importantly, I'm saying that Victoria Station wasn't a Nazi salute. It was the wave of a man who is drowning. The press conference ended shortly after that. Patricia practically dragged Bowie from the room while journalists shouted questions that would never be answered. The footage would be edited, sanitized, and released to the media with most of Bowie's confession removed. The record company would spin the story as a misunderstanding cleared up. But the people in that room knew the truth. They had witnessed something far more dangerous than a celebrity defending a potentially career-ending gesture. They had watched a man confess, in real time, to losing himself so completely that he could no longer distinguish between the character and the person. What happened in the months following that press conference would determine whether David Bowie survived or joined the long list of the artists who burned too bright and consumed themselves. The Los Angeles that had seemed so glamorous had become a prison. The house off Doheny Drive had become a mausoleum, every mirror covered with sheets, every window blocked with heavy curtains. His assistant, Corinne Schwab, found him 3 days after the press conference lying on the floor of his bedroom, unable or unwilling to stand. He had been there for nearly 18 hours, staring at the ceiling, convinced that occult symbols were appearing in the plaster. That was when the decision was made. If Los Angeles was killing him, then he needed to go somewhere that would shock his system back into functionality. He needed somewhere cold, somewhere gray, somewhere that would strip away the glamour and force him to confront what he had become. He needed Berlin. The city divided by a wall, split between democracy and totalitarianism, caught in the permanent tension of the Cold War. It was the perfect external metaphor for Bowie's internal state, a self divided, a personality split, an identity caught between opposing forces. Berlin in 1976 was not a city designed for comfort. It was gray, cold, divided by concrete and ideology. The wall ran through its heart like a scar. For David Bowie, it was exactly what he needed. He arrived in September with almost nothing: a few suitcases of clothes, his collection of occult books that he would later burn, and a determination to either find himself or disappear entirely trying. The apartment he shared with Iggy Pop at Hauptstrasse 155 was modest, almost aggressively normal. No gold records on the walls, no mirrors, just 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living room that looked out over the gray streets of West Berlin. The routine they established was deliberately mundane. Wake up, eat breakfast at a Turkish cafe, bicycle to Hansa Studios, located literally in the shadow of the Berlin Wall, work on music for 10 hours, bicycle home, sleep, repeat. It was the opposite of everything rock stardom was supposed to be. There were no groupies, no parties, no endless nights of excess. There was just work, discipline, and the slow, painful process of building a self from the ruins of too many characters. The music that emerged from this period would later be called the Berlin Trilogy: Low, Heroes, and Lodger. These albums sounded like nothing Bowie had made before. They were strange, electronic, influenced by German bands like Kraftwerk that had been making experimental music while Bowie was playing the Thin White Duke in Los Angeles. But more than that, they were honest. They didn't hide behind characters or personas. They were the sound of a man trying to remember who he was. Brian Eno, the experimental musician and producer who worked with Bowie on these albums, later said that the first few weeks in Berlin were difficult. Bowie was still physically dependent on cocaine, still prone to paranoid episodes, but slowly, day by day, the fog began to lift. I remember the morning he came into the studio and told me he'd slept for 8 hours, Eno recalled years later. He said it like it was a miracle. And maybe for him it was. Sleep, real sleep. That was the first sign that David was coming back. The recording of the album Heroes in the summer of 1977 marked a turning point. The title track was inspired by a true story. Tony Visconti, the producer, was having an affair with a German singer. Every day during the recording sessions, Bowie would see them meeting secretly by the Berlin Wall, kissing in the shadow of the guard towers, their love existing in the thin space between East and West. The song Heroes became about those lovers, but it was also about Bowie himself. The famous lyrics, "We can be heroes just for one day," weren't about permanent transformation. They were about the possibility of temporary redemption, of being better for brief moments even when complete salvation seemed impossible. Standing in Hansa Studios, looking out at the Berlin Wall, Bowie sang the vocal take that would appear on the record. His voice started quiet, almost whispered, and by the end was a desperate, soaring cry that seemed to contain all the pain and hope and terror of the past 3 years. When he finished, the studio was silent. Visconti, listening in the control room, realized he had just witnessed one of the great vocal performances in rock history. But more than that, he had watched a man claw his way back from oblivion. The 1976 press conference at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel never made it into the official Bowie documentary films. The record company made sure of that, buying up footage, suppressing the most damaging quotes, sanitizing the story until it became just another rock and roll anecdote about artistic excess. But for those 500 journalists who were in that room, for Michael Watts, who asked the question that almost ended a career, the truth remained vivid and unsettling. They had witnessed something rare in celebrity culture. Genuine honesty. Not the calculated confession designed to generate sympathy, but the raw, unfiltered admission of a man who had lost himself so completely that he couldn't distinguish between the character he played and the person he was. David Bowie survived that press conference, survived Los Angeles, survived the Thin White Duke, survived cocaine, and went on to create some of the most important music of the late 20th century. The Berlin albums, followed by his reinventions in the following decades, all traced back to that moment in April 1976 when he was forced to confront what he had become. Michael Watts, the journalist who asked the dangerous question, never regretted it. In a 2016 obituary piece for Bowie, he wrote, "I didn't ask that question to destroy him. I asked it because I needed to know if the artist I admired was still in there, or if the character had consumed him entirely." His answer, messy and confused as it was, told me that David was still fighting. And that fight, that refusal to surrender to the darkness, is what made him extraordinary. The final truth about that press conference is this: it was the moment David Bowie saved his own life. Not through a brilliant answer or a perfectly crafted response, but through admission of failure, through confession of weakness, through the simple, terrifying act of telling the truth about how lost he had become. David Bowie didn't just recover from addiction and psychological collapse. He turned that darkness into art, into Low and Heroes, and eventually into Black Star, his final meditation on mortality and identity, released 2 days before his death in 2016. The room at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel where that press conference took place was renovated in 1998. The mahogany table was replaced. The chairs were reupholstered. Nothing remains of that physical space except photographs and fading memories. But the moment itself remains as vivid and dangerous as ever. A man at his lowest point asked the one question he couldn't answer with a lie. choosing instead to tell a truth so uncomfortable that it nearly destroyed him. And then, because he was David Bowie, using that destruction as the foundation for rebirth. That's the real story of the press conference. Not scandal averted or controversy resolved, but transformation witnessed, survival documented, and the slow, painful process of a man learning to be human again, after spending too long pretending to be a god.